Hello, you're watching the Great Canadian Bagel, and we are back with Canada federal election updates. And these will be on a probably monthly basis again, even though not too much is happening, but we're going to continue that way. Before I begin the video, I would like to just let everyone know that I am now running a new poll, as I discussed in my last live stream at the end of August, that will contain a federal, BC provincial, Quebec provincial, Nova Scotia provincial, and I'm going to try Newfoundland provincial. I have zero confidence that I will get enough Newfoundland respondents to actually do a poll, but we will try our best. I'm going to try my best to do this. I originally wasn't planning on doing Newfoundland, but there's an election coming up in Newfoundland and no one is fielding, so I thought I would give it a try. If you want to support my efforts, go into the link in the description below, fill out that poll, or not the description, the pinned comment below, fill out that poll, share it to your friends. If you're in Newfoundland, throw it far and wide. Any sample is necessary. So, with no further ado, let us begin. So, the first thing to note here is that basically nothing's happened. Essentially nothing has happened federally in Canada. We are in essentially the same state we were in end of April, plus or minus a few seats. And the seats that are swaying are just very thin razor margin kind of things. So they're not really consequential movement. However, this is not a great general position to be in for the Liberals and Mark Carney. My general rule of thumb I have used since I've really started going at the full swing of things here, so that probably would have been like sometime in 2023 when I really started to get going with this stuff, is winning an election buys you about 6 months of inflated polls. And then after that, it's based on if you're just good or not. How successful of a leader are you? Of a politician are you? And for those keen at math in the audience, September 15th, when this video is being released, is in fact not 6 months after April 28th. In fact, it is just shy of 4.5. So the fact that Carney is actually polling worse than he was on April 28th is not a good sign. It really tells me that, what it really should tell you is that Carney's mostly wasted his honeymoon. Now, this is not to say Carney hasn't done things that people have liked. Pushing back the EV mandate, that is a popular policy. The tax cut, that was pretty popular. There's a bunch of other little ones like that too, but the sum total of these policies he's done are really just amount to undoing the worst excesses of Justin Trudeau, and they're not really substantive, qualitative policies that really tell people, yes, we need Mark Carney in government. Now, right now, the Conservatives haven't properly relaunched a new campaign. They are just starting to, with things like Michelle Rampell-Garnier really pushing on immigration, and Poilievre himself pushing pretty hard on crime and self-defense. So there is a bit of a relaunch going on, and I would say, pragmatically, that these are much better issues to campaign on than the carbon tax was, or the aborted attempt to campaign on the EV mandate. Politically, it was very smart that the Conservatives didn't push that too hard. They pushed it probably hard enough that they can claim a bit of credit for the pushback, but they did not push it enough that they wasted political capital on something that was probably going to get fixed either way. There's just no way with something like the EV mandate that the incumbent government is going to sit there and be like, yes, let's torpedo the car industry. That's just not a thing the government's actually going to do once the rubber hits the road. You can have lofty ideas in the past where you're like, well, hopefully we'll eventually get to the point where we can do this. But once it comes to the point where you are actually doing it, if the numbers don't work, governments aren't going to commit suicide by basically destroying the car industry. That's not going to happen. So, with that said, what is the landscape? I would say right now, the best way to describe Canada politically is it's kind of a held breath. It's the moment before the storm hits where everyone has just waited nervously for what is about to happen. And the reason I say that is it's not at all clear what the path forward is for the Liberals, for the Conservatives, especially for the NDP. There's a bunch of big hurdles that are about to pop up in the near future. And the overall economy is not doing very good. We're shedding lots of jobs right now. GDP growth is low. And we are getting hammered in a double trade war with Canada, or the US and China. Now, the US trade conflict is not as substantial as some might immediately let you believe, because a lot of our goods are covered under the Canada-US Mexico agreement. But that's not all our goods. And a lot of our other goods are being tariffed by China. Canola and lobster being two really big ones, but there's others too. Those aren't the only two sectors, but those are the two biggest ones that I'm familiar with off the top of my head. And this is putting a lot of pressure on the economy. This is putting a lot of pressure on the Prime Minister. Because fundamentally, trade policy is one of the penultimate things that is federal responsibility. But then you also combine this with a lot of pressure that the immigration system is putting on things, with companies, as Michelle Rempel-Garnier is pointing out every day on Twitter at this point. I think we're at 17 days in a row for posting various job applications. We'll have very high unemployment rates in cities, and they're still looking for temporary workers to fill job placements. Things like that put a lot of pressure on the labor market. So these aren't good collective economic things. But you have this even further complicating issue economically in Canada, which is, yes, the immigration regime is putting a lot of downward negative pressure on wages and GDP growth. Just to be very, very, very brisk, it's hurting GDP growth because companies are being willfully inefficient. If they can just keep hiring new people, they're not trying to innovate, is essentially what's happening. And this is not just speculation. You can see this in the economic data. You can go to other people who are better versed at economics to really explain this to you, but that's just the gist of it. But there is the corollary to this, as our economy is now also propped up on cheap labor. So you can't just trivially cut off the pipeline. It will have negative side effects. But not cutting off the pipeline also has negative side effects. So you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Now, this would not be the end of the world by itself, but you combine this with a two-fronted trade war, a Canadian government that is quite hostile to major regulatory reforms or tax reforms that it probably needs to be doing to re-incentivize development in Canada. And it gets very tricky to path your way out of this. Now, the Carney government's flagship program to try to do this is this bill they passed in the spring, which gives the cabinet and the Prime Minister's office the ability to waive regulatory concerns for projects in the name of national interest. So in other words, they can declare a project is so important that regulations don't matter. It is going to happen anyways. And the regulations we're talking about are almost entirely environmental and not like safety or whatever. In almost all circumstances, when you're talking about development in Canada in 2025, the regulation people are referring to is environment. And a lot of these environmental regulations are not about things like CO2 emissions or dumping waste in rivers. It's environmental impact assessments. It's talking with every single local community to figure out what is the right thing to do or whatever, to get everyone to agree on something. Now, you can say, and there's lots of people who have argued pros and cons to why we should have community feedback and projects and all this such, but the sum total of all of these regulatory hurdles is nothing happens in Canada. And that's the key thing Carney himself is saying he wants to try to fix. Now, it's too early in his premiership to say if he will be able to fix that. But I think it's pretty easy to comfortable to say at this stage he hasn't done that yet. But we can really tell that this is kind of his focus. His focus in his plan for re-election is to try to salvage the economy in some way, shape, or form. At essentially the point of he was elected premier, the Canadian economy was going to be damaged. It's unavoidable. We were on the train track and the train was going to hit us. At this stage, the only thing the government is doing is trying to manage the impact of a train hitting us and minimizing the damage of that. And that train being Donald Trump. Now, and the economic nationalism of the US, which is being prompted because the US real global power is decreasing. Well, that's another topic for another time. Comment below if you want me to talk about geopolitics. I might, if people care. But what this means is Carney's entire premiership, his entire ability to win re-election, is going to be tied with, can he make the economy fine? Essentially, Carney is the prime minister elected right before a recession, when everyone knows the recession is about to happen and you're doomed to have the recession. And his sales pitch is, I can make the recession as good as possible. I can do the least harm he can. So with that said, I would say that what Carney needs to do to win is, by the time he goes to call another election, or another election is forced by either law or by a non-confidence vote from the rest of the parliament, Carney needs the economy to be in a position where either unemployment is good, GDP growth is good, and incomes are healthy, or we need to be in a situation where it looks like we've passed the hurdle and people feel like Carney did a good job. To give an analogy here, a lot of premiers across the country, Legault, for example, or John Horgan in BC, did a snap election after the peak of COVID. Now, the premise of that snap election was there's still a problem, there's still COVID going on, but I've done the job that is better than replacement. I did a great job, so you should re-elect me. And that's pretty much Carney's path to victory here. Now, there is a small wrinkle here. If his polling is sufficiently high, I have many sources telling me that the Liberals have considered, back when their polling was stupidly high, a snap election in next spring in advance of the USMCA renegotiations. However, with his current polling, with just this narrow of a margin, I don't think that is very likely to happen. Because even with nothing having changed substantially, here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 Liberal marginal seats for either the Bloc or Conservatives pick up. If all 11 of those seats were to swing, the Conservatives and the Bloc would actually have a majority. Now, you would also still theoretically have a majority with the Bloc and the Liberals, or the Liberals and the Conservatives, but the NDP alone would not be enough to give the Liberals a majority in the House. So such a even the most trivial, most narrow, most marginal seats flip, and you're in a bad water situation for the Liberals. Now, conversely, there are seats they could pick up. I'm not going to enumerate them. You can look at the map. But they could theoretically flip seats and then be in a better position with a majority. But with such a slim margin here, it would be a very high-risk gamble. So I don't really think it would happen unless you start seeing the Liberals actually pulling your majority territory. Or if it looks like, I don't know, Carney had a lot of recent success with trade deals, maybe. But assuming that spring election next year doesn't happen because the polling isn't supporting it, what I think you will see is Carney's going to focus his term on maybe he's going to try to get a better trade deal with the EU or build up our export capacity to the EU. Maybe he will try to get some trade deals going on with, like, I don't know, Japan or something. I'm not 100% sure off the top of my head all the countries Canada has trade deals with, now that I say this. But make more trade integration with these other blocs, because even, say, with the EU, we do have a free trade deal with them, but free trade deals are not generally universal. If Canada and the EU had no trade barriers, we would just be a common market. That is what the EU is among itself. France and Germany have no consequential trade barriers. In theory. Just like in theory, provinces don't have consequential trade barriers, but we all know that's also not true. But in general, there is no consequential trade barriers inside a single market. There are still barriers between the EU and Canada. So you could see something like that potentially doing. Though again, we do have a lot of limits to stuff like that. First off, we have basically no way to export oil in the East. And there is a lot of questions from very serious economists that I know, that is it even worth to export oil to Europe? At least in the medium term. And I will just caveat that is, they're not saying we shouldn't export oil. It's really just we should focus on building pipelines to BC to export to Asia. And it's basically hinging on that our oil is worth more money to Asia than it is to Europe. But I digress. So there is that wrinkle, but then you also have the other wrinkle that the port in Montreal, the port in Quebec City, the port in Halifax, St. John, all these other places are pretty near to capacity, or over capacity in many cases, and the rail infrastructure in, like, the Maritimes is not very robust, so we can't, even if we, say, doubled the Halifax container capacity, the train tracks are not, the train capacity to ship that to Ontario is not there. So a lot of infrastructure work would need to be done with that. It's not impossible, but it is a big hurdle. And we also have other very big hurdles at the same time that you have these kind of trade concerns and these trade issues going on. In that our own economy is going into a recession. Unemployment's up, GDP's down. Now, we're not legally in a recession, or technically in a recession just yet, but we've had a negative quarter of GDP growth. Our per capita growth has been down for many, many quarters now. 0 or negative for, like, I think 8 quarters in a row now. Maybe it's 12 quarters in a row now. Doesn't matter. Once you get past, like, 1 year of negative or 0 growth, it's not good. So there's, domestically, we have a big problem. Foreign, we have a big problem. So there's just an ocean of problems economically to deal with. It's probably the second biggest problem in Canada. The biggest problem, though, still is, in my mind, the national unity question. Now, since the peak of April and peak of the election, separatism in Alberta and, like, Saskatchewan has simmered down. We're no longer looking at a situation where it's likely or even vaguely plausible that an independence vote would succeed in the short term there. But as we learned the lesson in Quebec, short term is not everything. Yes, in the short term, for many, many, many decades, for most of my life, it seemed like a no vote or a yes vote on a referendum in Quebec was unthinkable. It wouldn't happen. However, we are now looking at a situation where that is possible. Now, if we go way, way back, and we go back to my spring poll. In my spring poll, I asked the question, do you want to become independent? And 39% of Quebec said, yes, let's become independent, with 9% undecided. It does not take a lot for this 9% to transition into yes. And that gives you 48. And a 48-52 vote brought to an election. If you repeat that enough times, like if you were to do that, there is a reasonably high chance that turns into a yes. Because statistically speaking, polling is not that precise. So this is just, especially in this case, because my sample size is 65, my margin of error is actually 12 here, so this is, technically speaking, statistically tied. But we wash that away, because I think my methodology is slightly more robust than the margin of error suggests, but I digress. Technically, it is a plus or minus 12. So it is very foreseeable that a referendum could happen. But it's not just that it's foreseeable from polls like this. We see it in provincial polls in Quebec. The PQ are polling at 38% right now. And that 38% is going to turn into a landslide victory at the polls if it holds for the next year. But the by-election suggests it's actually even better than 38%. If you recall back to my video after the last by-election in Richmond-Arthabaska, that was suggesting it could be in the realm of the mid-40% range. And if the PQ can stretch into the mid-40s, they can get a yes vote on a referendum. And if Quebec leads the way with a yes vote on a referendum, and the next Canadian election doesn't lead to success for the West will probably also have a yes vote. And that would be a disintegration of Canada, if that were to happen. So that is the biggest near-term problem. But this biggest problem is actually really heavily exacerbated by the second one, because a lot of the concerns with the rise of Albertan and Quebecois nationalism, what's really bringing that to the fore today is the fact the economy is broken. And the fact that our immigration system is too much. Too much is really alienating a lot of the Quebec nationalists. It's really inflaming it. And the bad economy is undermining a lot of the reasons to stay for Quebec. And it's really, very, very, really undermining the reason to stay for the West. Because if you are Albertan, many, many Albertans have expressed to me that they feel like the East is vetoing their economy, which I don't think is entirely fair, but it's understandable why they think that, because that essentially has been what happened, though it looks like that's what happened, but it's not quite accurate to say that is what happened, but I understand why they perceive it that way. It makes perfect sense. And the Liberals really don't do anything to justify themselves. Because what we really saw in the last 7 years of the Trudeau government, the first couple, like 2016, 17, a little bit into 18, he was more of a normalish center-left liberal type. Closer to, say, like a Paul Martin than his father. But then somewhere after mid-2018, after 2018, Trudeau really started shifting much more into social issues and much more into just bad economic policy, which has really brought us to the situation we are at today. And there's going to be it's going to be hard to fix this. It's not going to be impossible, but it'll be difficult. And that is the challenge Mark Carney has. And it's really all keeps bringing back to this. It's very possible still that Mark Carney will fix enough problems or be doing a good enough job that come the next election, he will either do fine or even get a majority maybe. But, and this is a big but, we're in a position where it's actually incredibly easy for the Conservatives to attack Mark Carney. In a sense, it's Trudeau set up the Liberals after 10 years to be in a position where they are vulnerable on every single front versus the average Canadian. All it takes is a Conservative willing to articulate it and fight it. Against Trudeau, it was the worst. Against Trudeau, the best methods were economic policy. Against Carney, it's going to be things like immigration, it looks like. Or the social policy, other stuff like the crime and drugs and stuff. Now, Carney's not super pro, like the soft on crime and the safe injection site stuff, but he also doesn't really care about that stuff. But he has this tendency so far to defend the general orthodoxy of the left wing on issues that are actually quite unpopular to defend that orthodoxy with. So this is kind of revealing a weakness in Carney, where his first instinct is to defer to liberal experts unless he himself thinks he knows better, and then he will override them. So on economics, Carney will freeball it and ignore the quote-unquote liberal experts on whatever they want, whatever they say, whatever they think is good policy. He will ignore them and do what he wants because he thinks he knows what he's doing. So far, I think he's done the correct decision, at least partially, on most portfolios he's touched economically. The question, though, is really to the extent that he's done it, but his freeballing on economics does seem to be working out for him. That's really his strongest suit as premier so far, and why he does still, I think, have a reasonable chance of being able to get a majority, even though he kind of wasted a lot of the time in the last month or so. Wasted a lot of his good graces. But he does seem to defer to orthodoxies on social issues, and that could be a big hazard. Now, the other thing I want to touch on in this video, but very, very briefly, is the NDP. Now, I have long made fun of the NDP because their leadership sucks. And we don't quite know what the leadership race is going to look like. We don't really know all the names yet. We think we do, but until everyone has passed the threshold of signatures and fundraise dollars and all that stuff, I don't want to go too much discussing into it. I may or may not do some polling models for it, but again, we'll see how many polls actually come out for it. We'll see. But the NDP has a huge bucket to bail out of. The biggest thing is they owe a lot of money that they have to pay back to be a relevant party again. In fact, they actually do have to pay, I don't recall the exact number, but they have to pay like several $1 million by the end of next year, end of 2026, or else they will face campaign financing violations and be disbanded by Elections Canada. I think the NDP will be able to hit that threshold, but it is a looming axe over their head, which is really going to hurt them and hold them back for at least the next year and a half. But more importantly than that, it's going to be very difficult for the NDP to revive itself, because the NDP really doesn't have the talent and instincts to survive in this moment. I could be wrong. Maybe they will elect a good leader for themselves. But given the fact that Heather McPherson, who I'm at the time of recording this video, I don't remember 100% if she's actually officially in the race, but she's presumed to be joining the race and is likely going to be the front runner if she does. She does not strike me as the kind of person who is going to pivot the NDP away from social issues to economics. And I will at some point make this chart. I meant to make this for this video, but when you have a baby, things happen and you don't have time. I'll be honest, guys. I'd rather play with my son than spend an extra 5 hours making this video 10% better, because you don't really see it. I really do not see the extra views for putting in extra elbow grease. Really, like there's like the minimum amount of elbow grease you need to put in. You put 10% more, and I don't see even like 5% more views. So it's like, why bother? But anyways, I digress. So yeah, she doesn't strike me as the kind of person who will pivot the NDP in the way that it needs to pivot. And by that, again, I really mean they need to focus on economics and not on social policy. Because what I will be going on in a future video, I have this great flowchart that I'm going to go on, but the NDP only loses voters if they talk about social policy. The social policies that the NDP like right now in the year of our Lord 2025 are all vote losers. So talking about them at all is just guaranteed to lose them votes. They will only ever lose votes on social issues. But they can gain votes on economic issues. Though, that said, I don't think they're going to rebound. And the corollary to that is a lot of people on the right have been saying, can we even win if the New Democrats die or do bad? We're not doing well. And then I have to say, like, that's just preposterous. Again, if we go back to here, we look at this data here. This is the 2025 data. I'll zoom in a little bit so we can see it a bit better. This is slightly off the actual official results because this is accounting for like my turnout modeling and stuff like that. Because I'm too lazy to actually do that properly, but who cares? This data is called correct. Or it should be. But even if we go by this data with my wonky turnout modeling, or my future turnout modeling accounted for. And by the way, I do the future turnout modeling, so this is more representative of this, but every now and then it confuses people, so just accept it, okay? Just deal with it. The Conservatives are only down 2.5 as of this data here. And if we look at seats, they were only down 25. It's actually not very difficult for the Conservatives to gain enough seats here to actually be in a position to negotiate with the bloc for a minority. Again, they really only need to gain like 10 seats. And if they can gain 10 seats, you're really probably talking about like 1% of the vote. So if they gain 1% and the Liberals lose 1%, that's probably a Conservative government, even with the NDP at 6.3. The NDP being up at 7 point whatever doesn't matter. Like, the NDP is not directly relevant to the Liberals versus the Conservatives, because there's still voters who can turn out who didn't vote. There are still going to be people who voted Liberal in 2025 April who could change their mind to vote Conservative if the Conservatives run the right campaign, say the right policies, and the Liberals make mistakes. That is always going to be true. Now, I think you can say on the grand scheme of time that some elections are harder to win than others, and the dominant party will win 2/3 of them. You'll have elections like, say, the next Nova Scotia election, which, given the fact that Houston won such a stupefying majority, he'll probably win again. And it's probably going to be really difficult for the Liberals to beat Tim Houston in 2029. Or 2028, I should say. But, this is a big but, it's not intrinsically impossible, but this is even less impossible. So, again, you don't need a strong NDP for the Conservatives to win. It is always possible if you do the right campaign, nationally. If you go provincially, it's probably not possible for Wab Canoe to lose the next Manitoba election. He will probably win 2027. Unless, for some reason, he does something just horrifically bad. He'll probably win again. Doug Ford will probably win again. But you get people like David Eby. He could lose. He could win. We don't know. So, again, elections are not over until they're over. Don't doom about stuff like that. That's just silly. Or like celebrate and pat yourself on the back about this. Like there's no forever victory or forever lose. But I digress. Now with that, I bid you guys all adieu, and I will see you next week with something else. Make sure you fill out my survey though. Bye.